They thought it was just another test, a quiet lab, a strip of ancient linen under the microscope. Then, a flash. Not from a bulb, not from the sun, something no one could explain. When they checked the instruments, the readings made no sense. An energy burst so strong it could have scorched an image into cloth in less than a second. And the cloth. The most controversial relic in the world. The Shroud of Turin. What they saw under magnification froze the room. The image wasn't painted. It wasn't burned, it wasn't printed, it was inside the fibers, only on the outermost layer, thinner than a human hair. No pigments, no brushstrokes, no chemicals. It looked as if the image had been branded into the linen by a light no artist could produce. One scientist leaned back in his chair and whispered the unthinkable. "This doesn't look like decay. This looks like transformation." Then came the second shock. Trapped between the threads were tiny particles, pollen, but not from Europe, not from the Middle Ages. These grains came from flowers that bloom only in Jerusalem, in the spring. Some were from plants that no longer even exist in the region, extinct for centuries before the shroud appeared in Europe. It was like the cloth had carried with it a trace of the very hills and gardens where it might have once lain. Under ultraviolet light, the faint marks became clearer, a bruise swelling across the cheek, punctures along the scalp, deep wounds at the wrists and feet. The blood wasn't the dull brown of paint. It tested positive for real human hemoglobin, and it contained high levels of bilirubin, a chemical the body releases during severe trauma. The flow patterns matched what we now know about Roman crucifixion, the angles, the positions, even the blood trails running down the forearms. The shroud wasn't just a picture, it was evidence, as if a crime scene had been frozen in cloth. But then came the detail that defied reason. The blood wasn't smeared or disrupted the way it would be if a body had been unwrapped. It lay cleanly on the fibers, almost as though the body had passed through the linen without tearing it away. And if what comes next is true, it changes everything. So before we go further, make sure you're subscribed, because what you're about to see has been hidden for centuries, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why. The first real clue that the image was something beyond human skill came more than a century ago. In 1898, when the shroud was photographed for the first time, the glass plate developed with a shock. The image looked like a perfect photo negative. In the negative, the man's face appeared with incredible detail. Eyes closed, beard visible, every wound in sharper relief. No medieval artist could have predicted how a photographic negative would work. The technology didn't even exist. And when modern 3D imaging was applied to the shroud, it revealed something even stranger. The image contained depth information, like a three-dimensional map of a human body. No paint, no dye, no medieval technique could explain it. Of course, in 1988, the world thought the mystery was solved. Carbon dating tests claimed the shroud came from the 13th or 14th century, a clever fake from medieval Europe. The headlines screamed forgery, and the debate seemed over. But decades later, scientists discovered the samples had been taken from a corner of the cloth that had been repaired after a fire in 1532, a patch woven with newer threads. When untouched fibers were finally tested, the dates shifted dramatically. Some estimates landing in the 1st century, the very century the Gospels place the crucifixion. Buried deep in Vatican storage, textile experts made another discovery: faint, almost invisible burn holes in repeating patterns. They weren't random. They matched exactly how the cloth would have been folded for public display. Historical records from Constantinople described a mysterious burial cloth shown on holy days, one said to bear the face of Jesus. Descriptions from those records match the face on the Turin shroud, and they were written hundreds of years before it ever appeared in Europe. Then, in one of the most unexpected turns, particle scientists found traces of a rare mineral embedded in the linen, aragonite, the same kind found in ancient tombs in Jerusalem. The chemical fingerprint matched exactly to a specific burial site outside the city walls. It was microscopic dust, the kind you could only pick up by actually being there. When scientists tried to recreate the image, the results were even more baffling. They used one of the most powerful ultraviolet lasers in the world, pulsing beams of light onto a sheet of linen. The result was faint, crude, nowhere near the complexity of the original. And the energy required? Far beyond anything humans could produce outside of massive research facilities. And even then, only for a fraction of a second. One researcher stared at the failed replica and finally said what no one wanted to say out loud. If this image was formed by light, it wasn't light from here. The silence in the lab felt heavier than the linen itself until another scientist leaned over the microscope and froze. There, caught in the ancient fibers, were microscopic flecks that didn't belong. Not dust, not pollen, fragments of bone. The mineral structure matched human skeletal material, shattered into particles small enough to pass through cloth, and each speck aligned perfectly with the wounds, wrists, feet, ribs, as if the very moment of death had released more than blood. A chemical analysis of the blood revealed something even more unsettling. Traces of a rare AB blood type, found in less than 5% of the global population. The same blood type identified on another ancient relic, the Sudarium of Oviedo, a blood-stained cloth historically linked to the burial of Christ. When the DNA markers were compared, the results weren't just close. They were nearly identical, as though the two cloths had touched the same body within hours of each other. In a climate-controlled Vatican archive, a curator unlocked a drawer no camera had ever filmed. Inside was an illuminated manuscript from the 12th century, a copy of a Byzantine eyewitness account describing a cloth that bore the full form of a crucified man as though made by light. The description included details absent from medieval art, but perfectly matching the shroud. The piercing at the wrists instead of the palms, the twisted posture of the legs, the crown-like wounds on the scalp. No forger in medieval Europe would have guessed these details because no one painted them that way until centuries later, when archaeology proved them correct. In a locked imaging suite in Italy, scientists subjected the shroud to X-ray fluorescence. To their shock, they detected faint traces of coin-shaped patterns over the eyes. The imprints matched first-century Roman lepton coins, minted under Pontius Pilate, around the very year historians place the crucifixion. The patterns were so subtle they could only be seen with advanced imaging, meaning if they were fakes, they would have been invisible to the human eye for centuries. And yet, the strangest data came from an area no one thought to study, the space between the threads. There, clinging like whispers in the dark, were organic residues not from human skin but from burial spices, myrrh and aloes, the same substances recorded in ancient burial customs of Jerusalem. Their chemical signature was unmistakable. The cloth wasn't just near a crucified body, it had been prepared for it. In a sterile chamber in the French Alps, a team tested for radiation effects. When they compared the image density to known radiation burns, the results aligned too closely to ignore. The shroud's image behaved as if it had been exposed to a burst of radiation from within, one so brief and intense it altered the chemical bonds of the fibers without burning them. It was the kind of radiation spike associated not with decay, but with an instantaneous release of energy. Meanwhile, in a secure facility in the U.S., a forensic facial reconstruction expert ran a 3D scan of the shroud's face. The results weren't stylized. They were startlingly human. High cheekbones, a broken nose, a faint swelling under the right eye. The reconstruction looked less like an icon and more like someone you might pass in a crowded street, someone real enough to have lived, breathed, and died. Thousands of miles away, in a dusty library in Istanbul, a scholar unearthed a Crusader-era inventory list written in Latin. Among the listed treasures taken from Constantinople in 1204 was a cloth bearing the image of the Lord, not made by human hands. No painting, no weaving technique, nothing in medieval Europe could produce such an image. The phrase, not made by human hands, was a known marker for relics considered miraculous. This was centuries before the Shroud was first recorded in France. Back in the Vatican's own collection, a neglected 15th century letter surfaced. It described a secret meeting between church officials who feared the cloth's existence could be too dangerous to display, warning that it might cause upheaval among the faithful if it were ever confirmed authentic. The fear wasn't that it was fake, but that it might be exactly what it claimed to be. On the outskirts of Jerusalem, an excavation uncovered fragments of a first-century tomb, the kind used for wealthy burials. In the limestone dust was the same aragonite signature found on the Shroud. Tests confirmed the match within a fraction of a percent, making the probability of coincidence almost non-existent. The geological fingerprint pointed to a single origin, and it wasn't Europe. High-resolution scans revealed that the image on the Shroud showed no directionality, no left-to-right hand motion, no signs of pressure. Instead, the shading varied according to distance from the cloth, as though the image had been projected evenly from the body itself. To replicate that today would require a 3D scanning system operating with precision beyond even modern photolithography. In one of the most haunting revelations, spectroscopy revealed something the skeptics didn't expect. Tiny iron oxide particles laced through the stains. They dismissed it at first as pigment, until the chemical ratios told another story. The iron-to-protein balance was identical to hemolyzed blood, the chemical fingerprint of red cells ruptured by extreme trauma, and the streaks didn't sit randomly on the fibers. They obeyed gravity, flowing exactly as they would down the limbs of a crucified man. But the deeper shock came when decomposition was ruled out entirely. No residue from skin oils, no loose hair trapped in the weave, not even the faint molecular trace of flesh breaking down. The cloth carried the imprint of a body that simply wasn't there anymore. The official report softened the impact. The evidence suggests the body was removed without physical contact. But hidden inside those cautious words was something far more incendiary. The possibility that the Shroud recorded not a death, but what happened after. The instant those words left his mouth, the room fell silent. That was when the infrared results arrived. The scan pierced through the linen's threads and exposed something invisible to the naked eye. Ghost-like forms, etched deep in the fibers beneath the surface image. Not just an outline, but anatomical precision, muscle striations in the arms, the curved shadow of rib bones, the rounded dome of the skull. It was as if the fabric had witnessed the body, from the inside out. In a high-security wing of Italy's National Agency for New Technologies, a physicist pushed a classified folder across the table. Inside was an experiment few had seen. They had bathed linen in a controlled burst of neutron radiation. The fibers bore a faint, uncanny image, and something stranger still, the radiation altered the cloth's carbon isotopes, the kind of alteration that could make a medieval relic appear centuries older or younger than it truly was. And in that moment, the long-contested carbon dating of 1988, the one that declared the Shroud a mere medieval forgery, cracked wide open. If the image had been burned into the cloth by a sudden burst of energy, the date might have been an illusion from the very start. Half a world away, in a small church archive in Malta, a weathered scroll was unrolled for the first time in decades. It recorded the confession of a 16th century sailor who claimed he'd been ordered to guard a miraculous burial cloth transported under armed watch from the Holy Land. The account described the same herringbone weave as the Shroud of Turin, and the same strange glow when light touched the face. If true, the Shroud's journey may have been hidden in plain sight, disguised among relics looted or rescued during the Crusades. In a sealed cryogenic chamber in Paris, a forensic biologist analyzed the Shroud's blood at the molecular level. What she found stunned her team. Fragments of DNA that, while degraded, still showed rare sequences found predominantly in Middle Eastern populations 2,000 years ago. They weren't enough to identify an individual, but enough to narrow geography and era. One of her colleagues, visibly shaken, refused to continue the extraction, saying, "We are looking at the molecular trace of the man in the cloth." On the outskirts of Turin, local legend told of a hidden vault beneath a 17th century monastery. When ground-penetrating radar swept the site, it revealed a sealed stone chamber. Inside, resting on rotting cedar shelves, were smaller linen fragments, all scorched and brittle. Preliminary tests suggested they were cut from the shroud itself, preserved as relics before the 1532 fire. These untouched fibers may hold the most pristine samples yet, if the Church allows them to be tested. In the dim light of an imaging lab, ultraviolet photography revealed something impossible: delicate fingerprints in the bloodstains around the wrists. They weren't smudged, they were pressed, as though someone had touched the wounds after the blood had pooled, yet before it dried completely. The prints didn't match any known person in the chain of custody, raising the disturbing possibility they belonged to someone present in the original burial. A rare document in the Vatican's restricted section surfaced, a letter from the late 1800s describing the shroud's first modern exhibition.
In it, the author claimed that several witnesses reported a faint heat radiating from the cloth, like standing near the embers of a fire, even though it had been stored in the cold for months. No scientific explanation was offered, and the observation was never published. In a military research lab in the United States, a classified optical scan was performed using hyperspectral imaging, the kind normally reserved for satellite reconnaissance. The scan detected minuscule traces of limestone dust lodged in the weave, the same limestone found only in a specific quarry outside Jerusalem, near what is believed to be the site of the crucifixion. The match was so precise that geologists could pinpoint the exact vein of stone. A Byzantine icon in a remote Greek monastery showed a face unlike any other depiction of Christ from that era. When overlaid digitally with the shroud's face, the features aligned with near-perfect precision, matching proportions down to millimeters. The icon was dated to the 6th century, suggesting the shroud's image was known and revered 1,000 years before it ever reached Turin. In a secure lab in Switzerland, an experiment was conducted to simulate a body wrapped in linen decomposing naturally. The result: within days, the fibers showed clear signs of staining and fiber breakdown, nothing like the clean, undisturbed weave of the shroud. The absence of decay wasn't just unusual, it was physically impossible without removing the body in a way that defied natural law. A set of 3D renderings reconstructed the entire figure from the shroud, front and back. The wounds, the posture, the dimensions, all matched a man about 5'11", lean and powerfully built. The physical strain shown in the shoulders and legs was consistent with prolonged torture before crucifixion, but the most haunting detail was in the neck, a posture suggesting not just death, but the moment just before a body would inhale again. Deep in a locked room beneath Notre Dame Cathedral, archivists unearthed a medieval reliquary with a carved lid. The carving showed a rectangular cloth with a faint human figure surrounded by rays. The accompanying inscription read, "Linteum Resurrectionis," the cloth of the resurrection. It was dated to a century before the shroud's first documented appearance in France. In a Vatican lab, a fiber sample was exposed to a sudden pulse of electron beam radiation. The surface discoloration looked eerily close to the shroud's image, but the equipment required to produce it filled an entire room and consumed more electricity than a small city. One scientist quietly asked the question no one wanted to answer. What kind of event could deliver that much energy from inside a human body? Half a continent away, in a monastery in Spain, a monk guided visiting scholars into a dim, stone-walled chamber. There, on an oak table, he placed an ancient lead-sealed chest. When the clasp was pried open, the scholars froze.
Inside lay a folded cloth fragment, its weave identical to the Turin shroud, the blood type a perfect match. Monastic records claimed it was a secondary cloth, briefly used when the primary burial shroud was removed. If authentic, it hinted at something staggering. The Turin cloth might not have been the only witness to whatever happened in that tomb. That suspicion deepened in Madrid. In the locked basement of the royal palace, conservators prepared an unopened diplomatic pouch from the 17th century for examination. When X-rays passed through the leather, a ghostly silhouette emerged, another folded linen, its markings eerily similar to the Turin image. No one knew who had sent it, why it was sealed away, or what power it was meant to hide. The pieces of a puzzle were forming, pointing not to a single artifact, but to a chain of relics, bound together by one blinding moment no science has yet explained. And the trail did not end there. Beneath the Vatican Apostolic Library, far below the marble floors where tourists wander, a steel cabinet marked Proprietas Pontificia, papal property, was unlocked for a rare inspection. Inside were 7 lead cylinders, each protecting tightly rolled documents. One described an unsanctioned test from the 1970s when a single fiber from the shroud was placed under vacuum photolysis. Midway through the process, the lab was filled with a flash so intense it seared the ceiling, yet the fiber itself remained untouched. The report stopped abruptly there as if the rest had been deliberately withheld. At a facility in Geneva, climate-controlled and hidden from public access, archivists revealed a sealed photographic plate taken in 1931. On the plate, faint arcs of light haloed the figure's head, invisible in the standard prints released to the public. The photographer had sworn under oath that no such effect appeared during the exposure. The arcs only revealed themselves decades later when the plate was reprocessed with modern scanning techniques. A retired Swiss guard stepped forward with a confession he'd kept for 30 years. During a midnight watch over the shroud's reliquary, he claimed to have seen a faint shimmer pass across the linen, as though light were moving under the weave. He reported it to his superior, and was transferred within the week, sworn to silence. His transfer orders carried no explanation, only the Vatican seal. In the mountains of Armenia, a hidden chapel held a mosaic from the early 5th century. It depicted a burial cloth held aloft between 2 angels, but with the figure inside drawn not in muted tones, but in blinding gold tesserae that caught the light like fire. Inscriptions around the border translated to, "The cloth that saw the dawn." The most tightly guarded find came from a particle accelerator in Japan, where a team ran ultra-high-resolution scans of a thread taken decades earlier. They detected a complex pattern of discoloration at the molecular level, a gradient so precise it behaved like a binary code. When mapped into a digital grid, the pattern produced an image within the image, a hidden second face staring upward with eyes open. Thousands of miles away, in an abandoned chapel in southern France, restorers pried open a cracked altar stone. Inside was a leather pouch containing a folded scrap of parchment, stained with something dark. The inked writing was nearly gone, but one phrase remained legible, "Et in illa lus, corpus non remansit," and in that light, the body did not remain. In a hidden wing of the Louvre's archives, an art historian discovered a forgotten panel painting from the late 1200s. It showed a crucified man not nailed through the palms, but through the wrists, a detail archaeologists would not confirm until the 20th century. The painter's notes mentioned working from the holy cloth in the East, suggesting first-hand knowledge of the shroud centuries before its arrival in Turin. An unmarked box in a London antiquarian's collection contained a 17th century astrolabe, and tucked into its case, a folded vellum letter. The letter described a relic brought to England from the papal vaults in Rome that gave off an unearthly warmth when touched. The relic was never identified, its location now unknown. In Rome, a technician repairing a fiber optic camera in the Vatican's conservation lab swore he saw a flicker on his monitor, not from the camera but from the shroud itself. The flicker pulsed like a heartbeat, then vanished. The lab director dismissed it as static, but the technician quietly made a backup of the feed before it was erased. And in a remote monastery in the Sinai desert, a fragment of ancient linen was found hidden inside the hollow of an old wooden cross. When examined under polarized light, its weave matched the Turin shroud exactly, thread for thread. But this fragment contained no image, only the faint, sweet scent of myrrh still lingering after 2,000 years. A digital imaging breakthrough in 2021 revealed something no one had noticed before. When the shroud's face was overlaid with historical star charts, the tiny blood flecks and marks formed a pattern eerily close to the night sky over Jerusalem during a single spring equinox in the 1st century. It could be coincidence, or it could be something else entirely. In a locked chamber deep under St. John Lateran, a reliquary case contained a strip of cloth identified only as linteum secundum, the second linen. Its weave and age matched the shroud, but its stains told a different story. Handprints pressed into the fibers as if someone had gripped it tightly while in unimaginable pain. A team of geneticists in Israel, analyzing trace DNA on the shroud, identified a mitochondrial haplogroup shared with ancient remains from Galilee. One of them, a lapsed believer, walked out of the lab mid-analysis and never returned to the project. From a monastery attic in Cyprus, a chest of icons was opened for the first time in centuries. One icon depicted a figure wrapped in linen, surrounded not by mourners, but by a blinding column of light splitting the frame. The back of the icon bore a single word: burned into the wood, anastasis, rising up. And finally, in the early hours of an unpublicized research night in Turin, 3 independent observers documented something no one can fully explain. For exactly 43 seconds, the shroud's image intensified, as if the fibers themselves were glowing from within. The cameras recorded every frame, but when the footage was reviewed the next day, the glow was gone, replaced by static. The linen lay in silence, as it had for centuries, its secrets still locked inside.